Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the timely launch of Road Mapping, a viable community-led sector for Ireland. It's great to see so many of you here. There's over 500 bookings, so it really shows there's an appetite for a different approach to housing. This initiative was instigated and led by SOA Research with support from the Housing Agency, the Land Development Agency, the Callan Co-Housing Alliance, included a consortium of 8 emerging community-led housing projects from across Ireland. Other stakeholders included policymakers, local authorities, financial bodies, housing practitioners and professionals, along with expertise from other projects from other European countries. I'm Davy Phillip, and I'll be moderating today. I'm a facilitator and trainer with a focus on sustainable community, and I've facilitated the forums and the stakeholder meetings for this year-long research project. I'm based in the pioneering community-led housing initiative, Cloghjordan Eco-Village, that I've been involved in since 1999. And through this, I've learned that community-led housing can do more than just provide homes. It can also overcome social isolation, enhance our well-being, and enable people to be part of an active community that encourages mutual care. I'm currently working on prototyping a co-housing neighbourhood within the Eco-Village with Cloghjordan Co-housing.coop, and we're one of the 8 projects involved in the research through a community of practice that deepened the different projects learning and also contributed to the SOA research. Our proposed development with Cloghjordan Co-housing, which has learned so much from our involvement in this process, is framed as a climate smart pocket neighbourhood and aims to demonstrate an affordable, diverse and cooperative model of housing, but with an emphasis on placemaking, regeneration and resilience. What if, as well as providing homes, our neighbourhoods enabled sharing, co-caring and meaningful collaboration at the same time addressing sustainability, mental health and climate issues? This morning, we're going to hear more on the objectives and the key findings of the road mapping a viable community-led sector for Ireland from SOA. We're going to hear from Circa Edwards, the Secretary General of Housing Europe, she'll be discussing with me what housing issues can be addressed by a community-led approach. We have a couple of local projects that are highlighted in the report. And with us today, we have Rosie Lynch from Nimble Spaces, who are developing inclusive neighbourhoods, and musicians LOAH and Brian Dillon, who are part of the Arthouse project. Rory O'Donnell, the former director of NESC, is with us to look at the policy and financial challenges of community-led housing. And there'll be time for questions and comments, which I invite you to put in the chat throughout the session, and the SOA team will select a few of them to be asked in the time allocated. Today, we'll end with some closing remarks from Eddie Taaffe from the LGMA on the role of local authorities supporting community-led housing. To get us started though, this morning, we have an opening address from John O'Connor, who's the CEO of the Housing Agency of Ireland and one of the sponsors of the research and the hosts of today's event. So over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Davy, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. I am delighted to launch this very important series of publications on community-led housing. Just so you all know, the full title of the Housing Agency, its full name is the Housing and Sustainable Communities Agency. You know, sustainable communities being so important. So as such, we are delighted to support this SOA research, which is really critical. This research highlights how community-led housing can play a key role in providing sustainable homes and the needs of residents, through collaboration, empowerment, and mutual support. But it's about people coming together to provide housing and build a community, and we need to support that in a really big way. During this webinar, we will hear from several housing experts who will discuss community-led housing in a broad policy context. However, I'm also pleased that we will hear from some of those who are already putting the principles of community-led housing into action in their own communities. When discussing housing, it is important that we remember we are talking about creating homes and building communities. And that is so important. It can be lost so easily. Very important that we're creating good places for people to live and creating communities. The community-led co-housing projects are a great way of doing this, and doing this in a sustainable way, not only creating sustainable communities, but also addressing our climate change and biodiversity issues. It is important that we listen to those that are taking new and innovative approaches to delivering sustainable communities. Now, above all, today, I would like to thank Padraig Flynn and Tom O'Donnell in SOA Research, who have put a huge amount of work and effort into the research and pulling together and producing these fantastic publications. So a real big thanks to Padraig and Tom for all their work, and I'd like us all to thank them so much today. And thanks also to all the members of the steering group who lent their advice and expertise, and those who took part in the interviews and gave their support to this work, including the Land Development Agency, O'Coolin Co-Housing Alliance, the Gotha Institute of Ireland, and many colleagues here in the Housing Agency. I'm sure you will find today's webinar very informative and engaging. I would encourage you to get involved in the question and answer session later in the webinar. And when you have time to delve into the publications that have been produced by SOA that provide an important roadmap towards a viable community-led housing sector in Ireland. And also I'd ask any of you who can even more actively support this concept and delivering co-housing by providing land and providing support. If any of you listening here today can actually very actively support and deliver actual projects, please do so. So thank you all for listening. I'll hand you back to Davy.
Thanks, John, and thanks for the agency's support. So before we get into things, it could be good to get a sense of who's here. And again, we can do that in the chat, just introducing yourself, as some of you have already begun to do. But also we're capturing any insights or comments or questions that we've got a space to hear some of as we go through. So please do that. So first up, we have the directors of SOA Research, who are Padraig Flynn and Tom O'Donnell, who have instigated and coordinated this research project. And they're just going to share with us the background of the project and some of its key findings and recommendations. So over to you, Tom.
All right, so thanks very much, Davy, and thanks very much to John O'Connor for your introduction. So I'd just like to begin by introducing SOA Research. So SOA Research CLG is a not-for-profit action research think tank formed in 2017 to research and promote cooperative and collaborative approaches to housing in Ireland. We wanted to focus on quality of housing and neighbourhood design and community engagement in the process. So since 2019, we've hosted a series of events around Ireland, including an international conference in Dublin, to provide a space for alternative discourses on housing and community development in Ireland. And at the conference, international speakers highlighted European and UK policy support measures for community-led housing, and brought into relief the need for research in Ireland to develop a support infrastructure for community-led housing here. Next slide, please. So what is community-led housing? Community-led housing is an umbrella term which includes residence cooperatives, community land trusts, co-housing, and self-help housing. The unique feature of community-led housing is the empowerment of future residents to meaningfully participate in both the design and long-term management of their homes. So community-led housing offers a whole spectrum of possible approaches, and although no two projects are the same, they all share a common goal of meeting specific local needs with collaboration, empowerment, and mutual support. Next slide, please. So it's a socially, environmentally, and economically sustainable approach which typically has the following features. There's meaningful community engagement and consent throughout the process. The local community group or organisation owns, manages, or stewards the homes in a manner of their choosing, and the benefits to the specified community are usually clearly defined in the constitution of the group. Next slide, please.
Hi everyone. So we just wanted to touch on the benefits and the benefits community-led housing can offer in Ireland, and the challenges, the particular challenges for the Irish context that it helps to address. So community-led housing provides a framework for cooperation in the creation and revitalisation of new and existing neighbourhoods. It empowers people and empowers residents and communities to collaborate together from the outset. It's inclusive. It brings everyone together early on so they get to know each other and work together before moving in. It's a sustainable approach to use of resources, often sharing resources, and it also is an efficient use of land and land management. It's future orientated. Its housing is designed by the specific user rather than a speculative developer, and it's affordable, and it's reasonably priced homes in perpetuity. So just next slide, please. So in terms of specific challenges for Ireland, I think we've heard a lot about this in the last week. And I suppose the core feature of community housing is that it's premised on the conviction that a house or an apartment is not just a building or an asset or a unit, it's a home and a place to live. So particular challenges which CLH is kind of addresses in Ireland is a lack of agency and self-determination for residents. Homes are typically built by speculative developers who assume their needs, and I think we've heard a little bit in the last week about housing which doesn't reflect the needs of single people, older people, and a whole range of other demographics in Ireland. It also addresses poorly integrated housing and the challenges and roadblocks for people who try to blend different types of housing, such as affordable, cooperative, and market. I think Rosie's going to talk a little bit about that later. And it also addresses housing affordability and policies presently, which typically address affordability only at initial purchase. Community-led housing considers a long-term affordability for future generations. And just to kind of sum up the benefit again, it strives to ensure a holistic social, environmental, and economic well-being of the inhabitants. So next slide.
So as a starting point for the project, following an event in 2018, we received this email which set out some of the fundamental roadblocks or obstacles facing groups and people. So people, as Padraig said, who are self-employed or older, those who don't have large savings, have little agency in addressing their housing needs and ideals. Next slide, please. So although people might have a vision as to how they want to live, at the moment there is no clear path to organising, financing, and delivering a community-led housing project. So this project provided a starting point for looking at ways to roadmap inclusive models that accommodate the broadest range of people of different backgrounds in models such as residence cooperatives and the Community Land Trust. Next slide, please.
Okay, so just the aims of this particular project. Multi-stakeholder engagement was a huge part of it. The research is grounded in European best practice with examples from across the EU and the UK. But the forum process and the stakeholder engagement process we used helped to anchor the research in the specific Irish context and brought the expertise of a whole range of actors to the process, and it also helped to build recognition with different state agencies and local agencies. Another aim of the project is to set out the argument for community-led housing in Ireland as a complementary approach to other existing housing models. It's also intended to be the basis for a definitive guide for community-led housing groups and other stakeholders in Ireland. And it's intended to inform and enable policymakers to support community-led development. And next slide, please. So the structure of the publication, there's 5 booklets. The overview booklet provides a summary of the entire project, and we recommend that anyone reading the publication start with this as an introduction. The other 4 booklets address specific topics for specific audiences, but they're written in a way that should be readable for everybody, we think. they're not meant to be read cover to cover. The booklets are really formed as a series of modules on different topics. They're meant as a reference guide, which readers can pick and choose the areas relevant to them. And the research in general, it's building on present structures and existing models in Ireland, and trying to look at what we can do now in the short term and in the medium term as well to advance community-led housing. So next slide. And just to say, the roadmaps, each handbook contains one or more roadmap infographics. The overview handbook has 3 master roadmaps which set out the steps for developing a cooperative co-housing project in Ireland, a community land trust project in Ireland, and an owner-occupied housing project in Ireland. Each of the steps is also, the layer below shows the financing steps to each stage of the process. And below that, again, we've highlighted the roadblocks which groups participating in the project are facing at each of these steps, and directed to the area of the publication which provides recommendations for addressing these. And then each of the 4 additional handbooks has its own infographic which intends to summarize the contents graphically, and to explain the steps and the processes outlined in each booklet. So next slide, please.
Yeah, so one of the main outputs of the project are a series of recommendations that we hope will enable a broad range of approaches to community-led housing in Ireland. So the headline recommendations are recognition of community-led housing in policy, and more broadly, advancing of pilot or model projects to prove the concept, streamlined finance for community-led housing projects, and technical support to de-risk projects, as well as access to land. Next slide, please. So in terms of recognition in policy is necessary on a number of levels. It would provide a basis for local authorities and government agencies to engage with community-led housing. It would allow state agencies and possibly the banks to have a basis to provide financing to projects. And we're recommending a defined basis in law for the community land trust. So we would very much welcome the inclusion of community-led housing in the Housing for All policy action plan to be published in summer by the government. And we think recognition of community-led housing in policy would facilitate a rebalanced national discourse on housing and community development. Next slide, please. And again. So we're recommending a coordinated multi-agency cooperation with community-led housing groups to test the concept in different contexts in order to advance and refine policy, and to build capacity in the sector, and to develop public recognition of the approach nationally. Next slide, please. And again, please. So accessible, low interest, long-term finance is fundamental to delivering affordability. Financing is one of the major roadblocks facing community-led housing in Ireland. And we're proposing 3 forms of low interest products to enable the broadest range of approaches. So a generally available loan to part finance sustainable development mediated by commercial banks. And this product is based on the German State Investment Bank, the Taaffe model. We're also recommending specific loans for residence cooperatives. Residence cooperatives operate in a similar manner to cost rental and could be brought into the general measures available for this model. And finally, we're recommending a regulated investment fund that will allow credit unions and possibly pension funds to invest in community-led housing projects. Next slide, please. And again, please. So with regard to technical support, we're recommending a community-led housing hub, a single point, focus point for Ireland, following the example of the UK community-led housing hubs. And this will provide technical and financial support to community-led housing groups to de-risk projects, especially in the early and pre-planning phases of the projects. The hub can build capacity in the sector in local authorities and state agencies and amongst the wider public. And the hubs can feed back into policy development to help refine policy on an ongoing basis. Next slide, please. And again, please. So with respect to access to land, community-led housing is fundamentally oriented to the common good, and we're recommending a public land policy that allocates land on the basis of social value criteria and not price. This follows EU best practice, which promotes the best use of public land for fulfilling social policy objectives. And in the land booklet, we've outlined a procedure based on social value concepts for allocating land to community-led housing by local authorities and state agencies. Next slide, please. And again, please. And again.
Yeah, so the core next steps in the short to medium term that we see are recognition in public policy and, sorry, just go back one slide now. Recognition in policy and public discourse as well. We'd like to see pilot projects to prove the concept, and we'd like to see a point of contact to help build technical support and capacity of groups to deliver. Also, just to say regarding today and to support what John and Davey and Tom said about discourse and housing, we feel that community-led housing is a holistic approach which addresses a whole range of issues which include and are equally important to affordability. And the panelists today that we've invited, we're delighted that all of the speakers we've invited have agreed to join us. We were eager that the panel reflects a range of perspectives from the EU perspective to national policy to the particular motivations and experiences of community-led housing groups in Ireland. And we just wanted to leave you with just the next slide there, a quote from Frank Maloney of Cork City Council from 1982, which really sums up for us what community-led housing is about. He says that it's for the betterment of the human aspect and that all other aspects of housing should be made to conform to this. As the President pointed out in his foreword to the publication, community-led housing builds on Irish traditions, metal traditions of community build, and it represents bottom-up active citizenship at its best. So thanks.
Okay, thanks Padraig and Tom and all the team at SOA. This is a huge achievement and a fantastic contribution to the community-led and cooperative sector. It's great to see so many people here from such diverse backgrounds. So please, and from so many countries, there's not just Irish, so please continue to introduce yourself in the chat. Also, I can see there's a question and answers function in Zoom, just to note that for the SOA team, where I encourage you to put questions, insights, comments in the chat, but there's also people putting them in the Q&A button. Okay, so let's dive in. We're going a bit deeper. So first up, we have Circa Edwards, who's the Secretary General of Housing Europe. Sorcha is Irish. And has a long history of promoting inclusive housing policies and fair energy transition across Europe. You're very welcome, Sorcha.
I'm very happy to be here.
So we're going to get started with a question. Where do you see the benefits of community-led housing? And what EU housing issues can such approaches like cooperatives, community land trusts, co-housing, what can these help us to address?
Yeah, first of all, you mentioned that I'm Irish, actually, and I think maybe I'll kick off with that point, because we've really seen over the last years, Ireland and particularly large urban centres being a bit of an epicenter of the housing crisis. And from my perspective, I've been working with this organisation over 15 years, and we've been looking at being the voice of the different housing providers around Europe. You can imagine, very diverse, and the most diverse system seems to be the ones that work the best. So, you know, you have a system where you have 30% cooperative housing or limited profit housing around Austria, Denmark. So it's really a pleasure, really. I think the SOA and the Housing Agency are doing a brilliant job to promote also a more diverse approach to housing in Ireland. And of course, it's very much in the news at the moment because of the concentration of financialization, so finance going into the sector. But here we see the other perspective, so the growing community to bring about a more diverse housing system with a much stronger community-led housing focus. And at the same time, we see a big boost in the numbers of affordable housing unit homes being built by approved housing bodies. So it's I think Ireland has a really can use this sort of being in the news for negative reasons in a way that it's a hot point of the financialization, can turn it around and actually use this momentum and this attention to show all the different diversity that is actually being pushed through by people at the moment. So I think the CLT, the community-led housing, community-led trust movement has a huge role to play in tackling what is the broader housing challenge, housing crisis that we see. I think it's we've come to a point where we can, that public policies are really they haven't been fitting the bill basically over the last decades, not on across Europe, across the world when it comes to housing, because we've really been leaving too much space to the market and too much focus on broadening the room for the market to function. So I think particularly with this pandemic, we've come full circle, and it's really time to give the space to people-led, community-led projects to spearhead the move to a housing system that isn't focused on cleaning up the mess made after the market has failed to deliver what society needs, but really to give space for these types of community-led initiatives, more and more space, and really consult with them to see how they can be expanded, how they can be duplicated. So it's, we all hear at European level about the crisis, and it's coming to a bit of a head now. I mean, we estimate, Eurofound has estimated now that about 10 million people fear they could lose their home because it has become too affordable in the next 3 months. So that's figures out last week. There's 700,000 people who are sleeping rough at any one night in EU as well. So I think these issues have really come to a head and gained the attention also at European level, particularly from the European Parliament. Mm-hmm. And the time is definitely right to present the community-led housing movement as a key part of that solution to those challenges being faced, and to push for that.
So are we seeing, Sorcha, across Europe, mm-hmm. is the people-centered housing or a community-led approach being recognized by national governments? Are we seeing it emerging in policy?
Mm-hmm. So what's been, I think, a really nice achievement particularly on the policy level, because it's sort of a tricky issue to work on housing at EU level, because quite rightly, housing is a national, the decisions have to be made locally as possible and nationally. So you don't have a really clear, you don't have a housing strategy from the EU, let's say. So when we are working with the EU institutions, it's quite fragmented. So we have to look at, let's say, the directive that governs how, for instance, Airbnb is classified as a service or not. Or we have to look at state aid rules and look at how much state aid can be given to housing and in what capacity, or even tax rules. So it's really spread out across all the different EU legislation. But what we've had in the last just a few months ago is the European Parliament. I think gradually the message has come up, that the old people just so the homelessness rate, the people paying too much for their housing, the financialization, those messages have come through. And we've had an own initiative report from the European Parliament that tries to bring it all together. And so we had a Dutch MEP, Kim van Sparentak, Green from the Green Party from the Netherlands. And she managed to get the approval of the entire Parliament on an own initiative report. So I must say that it's not legally binding for the rest of the European institutions. However, she's put these issues very firmly on the agenda. And I think I was really happy to see she also specifically mentions the role of community land trusts as part of a move towards a more democratic and collaborative housing solutions. So I think that that recognition is growing, And we've also become, so the CLT Brussels has become partner in Housing Europe in 2019. And you can see as well the positive impact in a way of going back to the roots of community-led housing sector. You can see that is also having an impact. So I think there's some positive news, particularly coming from, as I say, those institutions like the European Parliament. Also, the Committee of the Regions has been very active on this and has a strong housing agenda, and also can be definitely an ally in promoting the community-led approach. But as I say, on the bigger picture, let's say EU policies, it's harder to get that to have such a clear-cut picture, and that's where I think all of the limited profit and non-profit housing providers have to sort of work together on that, on influencing that much bigger picture around Stability and Growth Pact and the competition law and those, let's say, more macro issues, particularly as we go out of the pandemic, because there's a bit of more room for influence now.
Could you touch briefly or just explain a little, because a lot of people, we don't have a community land trust movement in Ireland. Could you just touch a little about what that is and maybe how that approach has secured long-term affordable housing in France?
Yeah, so I suppose it's just one part of the community-led housing say approaches, and it has gained a bit of attention here in Brussels because of the CLT. Brussels has managed to get an excellent project up and running where SOA have been involved at the SHIC project, bringing together a network of CLTs from different European cities and creating a bit of momentum there. And I think the key factor there, and it really has struck a chord with with all of the, so we work with 46,000 local different types of housing providers trying to work on a limited profit basis. And there it really struck a chord because obviously they want to go to the heart of the matter, and that is to limit the land speculation, because it's what, even in the most, let's say, the systems that are managed to consistently deliver high numbers of housing where you have 30–40%, they're really coming up against that problem of the land, availability of land and the cost of land. So I think the key aim of the Community Land Trust, the one in Brussels anyway, it's about tackling that land speculation, which obviously then limits the speculation in the housing sector itself. And also the one in Brussels is about access to home ownership for very low income groups. But the CL2, it's very important to note that you can have the CLT model promotes a diversity of different housing tenures. So it's not limited to one tenure. So in France, we've seen, you mentioned the French model, and there we've seen let's say even a bigger take-up because of more and more cities and a national support for the initiative, and a legal framework, which of course is crucial, as Tom has outlined, and Padraig have outlined. Getting that legal framework and the financial framework right is vital. So there, I think France can be seen, I mean, it's the leader in many ways on different housing issues, but also there, I think it's really, once as possible, I think that you should all be getting on the ferry over to France to do some study visits around there for the joint inspiration. Great,
Sorcha, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for your work, and hopefully we see you back here in Ireland visiting some of the projects in the not too distant.
My dad has all his vacuolations now, so hopefully there soon.
Thank you, Sorcha.
Bye now.
Everyone, keep introducing yourself in the chat. It's a fascinating read now. Introduce to each other, not just to the panel. So as people are giving some information, it's a really rich resource in itself now, the chat. So we're going to go and look at some of the projects emerging in Ireland. And we're going to start with Rosie Lynch from Nimble Spaces and Inclusive Neighbourhoods. And Nimble Spaces is a really innovative housing project looking at inclusive neighbourhoods and developing long-term collaborations between artists, architects, and adults with disabilities. Welcome, Rosie.
Great, thanks a million. It's super to be here, and thanks so much to SOA for the invitation. and also for, you know, along with Davy and lots of others, being on this fascinating journey over the last few years to develop this, I think, really groundbreaking, significant piece of research.
So Rosie, let's get a sense of what Nimble Spaces is doing and what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, so maybe I'll answer that in kind of two answers, like very practically today. The Nimble Spaces project here in Callan has achieved planning for 25 homes across 3 sites, which we're calling inclusive neighbourhoods. So that's really exciting. We're at quite a kind of advanced stage in terms of community-led housing initiatives in Ireland. That has happened through incredible amount of work. We've been working on the project for the last 9 years. So there's been a phenomenal amount of resources, collaboration, and recently Hugh Brennan from O'Coolon and also SOA Housing have come in to support us to achieve the project. And it's also happening in collaboration and support also from Kilkenny County Council. But how did we get there? How did we sort of get to the point of, you know, bringing the project to planning and hopefully to construction in the next year? The process that what we were trying to achieve, and this was really in 2012, was to provide tools and an agency for people with a disability to be centre in developing their homes and neighbourhoods. So at that time, there was a new government policy around time to move from congregated settings. It was about setting a roadmap for people with disability to be able to live not in residential support, but live in houses in the community. And we felt that we really wanted to add a kind of a rich and positive part to that story, and really to bring kind of community-led housing into that conversation, and to be able to provide people with disability the kind of tools and agencies. So that's where the project started, and it's been a fascinating process of co-design and collaboration, and yeah.
Wonderful. What do you think a community-led housing approach could offer other rural towns?
I think that community-led housing can offer our kind of rural towns a huge amount. And just to say, like, this is, I suppose, the fact that we can now talk about this concept of community-led housing really is just because of the work that SOA have achieved through this roadmap. I think the last few years, you know, we've been kind of grappling with kind of fuzzy terms of co-housing and cooperative housing, and you know, I suppose our project is hybrid. It's a hybrid social and cooperative model. And so the fact that I think Tom and Padraig have really given us a tool of being able to integrate all of those things into this idea of community-led housing. So it's not a binary. But what I think community-led housing can do for our rural towns is, well, the problems that we're facing in rural Ireland are kind of opposite to what Sorcha described in terms of the hyper-financialisation, the investment that is driving our cities and, you know, kind of our homes in our cities into kind of tools of investment in our town centres. These beautiful homes that are in a lot of our rural town centres, they're derelict, they need a lot of input, and I think they need kind of community life and living to come back into them. And at the moment, they're seen as not being valuable, that almost by touching them, you're just going to get into debt. So they're kind of the opposite, I think, to our cities. And, you know, we've really seen this happen in Callan, that by kind of collectively coming together to think about Bridge Street, and by people feeling that they are not doing it alone, and more recently then the Kilkenny County Council supporting that process. I think that if we can start to look at kind of our, you know, it's fantastic that the programme for government has the town centre first at its heart, that I think community-led housing needs to be, you know, centre stage in the kind of town centre first approach.
So you're actually someone that grew up in community. Could you describe what the experience is like? What are the benefits of living in a community-led housing sort of project?
Yeah, so I grew up in Camphill, which is, I suppose, a kind of a forerunner of eco-villages. So I think it's something that you and I share in terms of kind of, I suppose, the traditions of intentional community and eco-villages, and Camphill is a worldwide movement. And I grew up in Camphill in Kilkenny called Ballytoban. And I suppose I just, you know, it's been fantastic, I suppose, to bring some of that experience into the into this road mapping project, because I suppose I have experienced, you know, the real benefits of community-led housing. And I suppose one of the key benefits that I've experienced is that by people pooling their resources, that there can be incredible kind of, I suppose, shared benefits socially, culturally. You know, that there is so much to gain from kind of people pooling their resources to make their neighbourhoods better. And I suppose, you know, as a child growing up, my security wasn't in that we owned our house, that my parents, you know, we didn't own our house, we lived in community houses. But I suppose what we did have, and my sense of belonging, was in the investment we had in our shared environment, that we put in so much kind of love and care into our environment, and that kind of sense of belonging really came from that.
So briefly, because we're a little out of time, but would government support or new policies for community housing help your project and others like it, Rosie?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of things, and I think they're all kind of captured in the roadmap and what Padraig and Tom have presented. I think at the moment, something that would really support our project is a kind of a legal definition for community land trust, because we're going to be building these, you know, beautiful homes that have been designed by the kind of future residents, but they're also very much kind of embedded in landscape, in social. We want there to be kind of social activity, and which again just really, I think, lends to kind of sense of well-being, sense of loss, you know, around issues of isolation. So we would, you know, our project would really benefit from community land trust being kind of a legal concept in Ireland. And the other thing that our project would really benefit from is for kind of government policy to help support the hybrid model between social and cooperative housing, because at the moment that has been a roadblock and it's been a challenge in our project, especially in financing some of the shared spaces.
Okay, Rosie, good luck with your projects. Great to have you today. Thanks so much. Okay, we're going to keep moving. We're going to hear from another emerging project, and we're going to bring in LOAH and Brian Dillon from the Arthouse Cooperative. Brian's a musician and a sound artist, and LOAH is a well-known singer and songwriter. Both are involved in the Arthouse co-housing project. You're very welcome. So, LOAH, what has interested Arthouse about a cooperative community-led approach to living and working? And what do you think the potential is? What does it offer younger people in Ireland?
Okay, well, I don't think I need to go into the details of what younger people in Ireland are facing. I think we all know, but certainly in our case, we are both living, working musicians and artists who are responsible members of society, and we pay our rent, but we're maybe not the top of the pile for being trusted with like large, you know, sums of money and mortgages and whatnot. So what we decided to do was come together as a group. Not only do we obviously need housing, but we also have very specific needs for space. So we often work from home, we practice at home, which requires certain amounts of soundproofing and you know, targeted spaces that are designed in a particular way. Our work is very collaborative. So, you know, we work with other musicians. We have to drive around the country a lot. We also have to work a lot in the city. So there's a lot of there's certain limitations in order for us to actually live out our careers in the most efficient way. So a bunch of us came together from very artistic disciplines. And so the idea was that we'd not only be living in a community which lends itself to the type of careers that we have, but also that we are able to use the designated spaces in a shared way that's best for our work as well. Sorry, Davey, we can't hear you. I think you might be muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I love that, LOAH, that sort of multiple function that we're looking beyond just housing. How do we work as well? How do we live and work in the places that we're engaged and active in? Brian, what challenges have Arthouse members faced in accessing housing and progressing a project like this?
I think I guess the challenges facing young people in Ireland with regard to housing, we're all quite aware of them at the minute. And I won't go into any of the obvious things, but for us more specifically, what we noticed, and from talking to members of the group about this, we all found similar issues, that regardless of the kind of the success we're having in our careers, both critical, artistically and financially, the lack of stability was a real issue for anyone who potentially would finance us. Mortgages, loans, these kind of things, which traditionally are a part of life and of moving on and of independence, just didn't seem to be things we could access because we didn't have long-term contracts, essentially. And it didn't really matter whether or not we had the ability to repay rent, which we all have and all have done. What was more important was that Arthouse was kind of seen as a bad word from a bank point of view. And so, as a group, we've been talking to financial advisors, talking to banks, and it's just been problematic, I guess. It's just been challenging in ways which we hadn't foreseen.
And just to add one point to that, because I think there's a lot of people on the call that would really appreciate hearing this directly. I think as a nation, we bank a lot of our kind of culture and our clout on artists, and as artists we feel that we'd like to get someone banking on us, and there's a mutuality there that we know we are integral to our nation. We really are, and I think we've seen that more than ever in the past year. But we kind of need a reciprocal understanding of the intrinsic rise and fall, and we all do very well to both rent our homes and rent studio spaces. So a lot of us are paying two rents, and we're very responsible in our own insecurity of our lives. So we'd kind of like to see a bit of a mutualistic contract between us and those running our situation, so that we can all do the best work possible.
I mean, with that in mind, I think a big part of our project and of our kind of intention is that we want to demonstrate that our value to community isn't just financial. That we're not just lenders who are paying money into a community and into a bank, that actually we can add a lot more to a community than that. And that's why the whole Arthouse project, as well as being housing for artists, we want working spaces, ideally we want studio spaces, and also we want community spaces where members of the wider community, not just members of Arthouse, can become involved, whether these are through workshops, through school engagement projects, through educational projects or residencies. We want to, just to give something back effectively. And I think, what Loa said there about if we're given that trust, we'd like to repay it, basically.
Yeah, again, it's sort of it's adding value beyond just housing and being a real asset in the community. So has the guidance set out in the research that we're publishing today, has that been relevant in assisting Arthouse moving forward?
Yeah, so what's really great and interesting about the guidance is that we've been meeting for a couple of years, because as Rosie, you mentioned, it's always a very long process, because it's all very innovative in our context in the Irish market. So we learned a lot of what's in the guidance but the hard way. So had we had that guidance when we were starting, I think we could have saved ourselves a good 2 years. So it's really helpful to have it all in one place. It's extremely clear and detailed, and the recommendations that you guys have put together are also so clear. So if for anyone who's listening and wants to know more, just head straight there, and it's a wonderful shortcut. And we were even saying today, we'll be using it for our next stage, because we've done a lot of the groundwork of visioning what it is that we want.
Thank you so much for joining us this morning, and thanks for the work you're doing in both Arthouse and the music. So appreciation for what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us, guys.
Okay, that was wonderful. So we're going to move from listening to some of the sort of emerging projects that we're seeing in this community-led housing project to maybe really look at the financial and policy considerations. So with us next up, we have Rory O'Donnell, who's a former director at NESC, the National Economic and Social Council, and is also a fellow of the Geary Institute at UCD. Rory's conducted many policy investigations on housing and land management in Ireland, and he's joining us today. Welcome, Rory. You're on mute. Such a common phrase in our Zoom world now, isn't it? Welcome, Rory. So could you just reflect on the case set out in the policy and finance handbooks for the infrastructure needed for community-led housing?
Yeah, I can. And by infrastructure, I think you mean the recognition and the definition of the model, maybe some pilot projects, creation of a support hub, as in London, maybe a fund for capacity building, and the legal definition of community land trust. And of course, the case for this infrastructure depends in a way on the strength of the overall case for community-led housing. And I have to say, I think this is a really, really valuable contribution. I think the undoubted need for better better big ticket policies at national level in the area of housing can blind us to the possibilities and importance of bottom-up initiative, engagement, and co-creation. And I think in that sense, the studies and the books address all the big ticket items in Irish housing policy and some other issues I'll mention, but in a really new way. I mean, on affordability, they're absolutely clear all the way through that we must think about permanent affordability, baked in or engineered in, not if you like, chased afterwards. A really interesting dimension is this, that these studies and arguments prompt a discussion which we haven't really had. What dimensions of home ownership do we value? Is it secure occupancy? Is it the right to adapt to your home? Is it security in retirement against excessive costs? Or is it the right to sell and make a capital gain? And I think we haven't really had that discussion. As we move now towards a new era of housing policy, we have to think that through. But as Rosie said, the studies also touch on really important, somewhat less prominent issues like social integration and the building of community. Standards, I see in this work a much more constructive discussion of standards than we've had in recent years. As the case studies include people adapting their homes, sometimes using what's called sweat equity to finish off their homes. But that's effectively a change in a standard, but in a voluntary and creative way, rather than having a stuck argument about a uniform reduction in standards, which is very contentious. And then there's the issue Rosie touched on of town centre development and rural development. And so many of our towns and cities are dead in the centre, and it's proving really difficult to unlock them. And I think this approach can really help in that respect, in building a consensus in a community and in a town about reusing very valuable, but at the moment derelict properties.
Yeah. So what macro challenges has the government failed to address in recent decades around housing policy? And could you reflect on some of the solutions or responses that are articulated in the research?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a huge question, Davy, because several, I mean, I would see it in two terms. In the decade 2000, 2010, if you like, in the boom, I mean, we can go into all the details, it's all been documented, but I would emphasize the following. There were certain things uncertain about the fiscal rules, about the banking, and when would the bubble burst, etc. But what was perhaps more important is that the fundamental political economy issues were unresolved. We couldn't decide, how are we going to achieve affordable housing? How are we going to pay for it? How are we going to manage land? What's the size of the state and what kind of taxation do we need? And that unresolved political economy, in a sense, showed up in all kinds of technical problems and banking crises. But behind it was, if you like, a lack of shared understanding. And I think in the decades since the crisis, I would say, again, because there's so much detail, the major difficulty has been getting from a view of the housing problem as a conjunctural one. There's a set of immediate constraints to recognizing that it's systemic. And I think we're now getting to the point where we see that it's systemic. It's not just that this or that factor, the cost of credit or the cost of land or land assembly or infrastructure, it's systemic. And I think, therefore, rather than focus on, if you like, failures, I think it's very interesting to think about now we're moving towards the possibility of a new shared understanding of housing. And it reminds me in a way when I first went to NESC in the late 80s, when we'd come out of 3 decades of crisis, where there was deep division on wages, on fiscal policy, on industrial relations, on job creation. And it showed up in poor social and economic performance. And I think we're at a similar point now where we need to recognize that the conditions that underpinned Ireland's approach to housing for 50 or 60 years, i.e. pushing home ownership to tax breaks, helped by inflation, plus residual social housing for the rest with tenant purchase, the conditions for that model are gone. And we need to, in a sense, I think maybe we're nearly there now, to frame a new shared understanding. And the lack of a shared understanding, I think, is making the contestation of immediate issues more contentious than it need be, like the use of Dublin City Council sites, some of the work of the Land Development Agency, how to achieve integration of different income groups. The lack of a shared understanding is making all of these issues more contentious than they would be if we had a clear picture of where we're going. And I think the government's idea of a housing commission is a great one, because there's a chance to articulate a shared understanding. And in fact, people sometimes miss the fact that there's perhaps more shared understanding than we realize. We've had 6 or 7 reports from NESC, you mentioned, and on that council sits the employers, the unions, the social pillar, the environmental pillar, and the agricultural interests. And they've agreed suggestions across a very wide spectrum. So I think we're on the cusp of, hopefully, a new understanding of what kind of housing system we're creating. And I see this work as a real contribution to that.
Thanks for that, Rory. And definitely that articulated shared understanding would help us imagine a different approach to housing. I think a lot of our co-housing groups struggle because it's not understood in society. If we go to a financial institution, it's not recognized, it's not a thing. So again, it might be a big question, but it's one that's coming up a lot in the chat. Looking at the research, what sort of, how would you envisage a way forward in financing this sort of emerging community-led housing sector?
Well, I mean, the documents do underline just how critical finance is, and in a way, how like the KfW in Germany, remarkable, 0.77% fixed over 20 years, really, remarkable starting point for affordability. And I think the report set out a kind of a spectrum of possibilities. One is greater access to the existing financial instruments, such as the Housing Finance Agency. Secondly, some seed capital for capacity building of this sector. And then thirdly, and I think this probably is necessary, some element of subsidy, because if I understand it correctly, the cases, they show that they mostly, in the Irish case, come out as with overburden, as the reports call them, or if you like, an affordability problem, especially where land cost is at the market rate. So I think there are real challenges, but this work is very helpful. Now, I would say that the cost rental equity loan in the forthcoming bill is a really, really important step forward. It involves 30% finance rolled over the long term and 70% long-term fixed interest rate from finance from the Housing Finance Agency. And that, having that at the center of policy, but if you like, on insufficient scale, is an enormous recognition of the need for a financing model. And I think it'll be interesting to think about how this community-led housing might mesh into the emergence of that instrument.
Do you think a shift in land management policy would have an effect on affordability in Ireland and the diversity of the types of housing that could be offered?
Well, I'd say two things. One is, I think we are seeing a major shift in land management policy with the creation of the Land Development Agency. This is really an historic shift in the willingness of the Irish system to be more active. Now, that does leave the question further to be discussed of whether more active management of privately owned land through compulsory purchase or is necessary. But I think one of the things that the work shows is that it's, and building on this land development agency, it's not just the static price of each of the factors of production, and land being a critical one, that matters. It's actually the process of housing and urban development. And like the land development agency is not just about, and any other form of urban development as documented in these great reports, is not just about the cost of land that comes out at the end of the pipe, if you like. It's about the really active engagement of very capable public actors with local groups in the process, in the highly complex process of land, of housing and urban development. And I think I'd be interested to see whether, for example, this community-led housing offers a way to ameliorate some of the debates that are emerging around, say, the Land Development Agency division between social, affordable and private. Now, those debates are getting very stuck and you can get very polarized views on them, but this kind of development offers a much more nuanced, possibly creative solution of finding the balance in any given city, whether it's Limerick or a smaller town or Dublin. So I would emphasize that it's land as a cost and urban and housing development as a process that these studies address and bring something new to. But I am struck by, there's a very good interview with Brendan Conway of the London Hub, and he does finish, and I will finish with this too. He says, in the end, sites are the holy grail, end of story. So we do come back to that in the end.
Well, thanks for your reflections, Rory. Stay with us because we're going to go into a bit of a panel discussion. Brendan is with us. I can see him in the chat. Also another Irish man living, or person living outside of the country and working on these issues that are more developed in London as they are in other places. Okay, so we have maybe 10-15 minutes for some reflections or questions. They're being fed to me from both the chat and the questions and answer function in Zoom. So I'm not sure which panelists will take these, but let's start with a question on community benefit, because there's quite a few coming in around what are the community benefits of community-led housing for the wider community, and can these benefits be used to make the case for funding? So we've heard, I think, from the examples that there is something broader here in a community-led housing approach than just securing homes. We've got to live, work and learn as well in our neighbourhoods. So anyone from the panel would like to maybe just explore that question a little bit more? What are the benefits for the wider community, and could there be a case for funding? Padraig?
Yeah, sure, we might come in on that. For the wider community, I mean, Arthouse touched on it there, the community-led housing projects around Europe are creating spaces that wouldn't otherwise kind of exist in cities and towns. They're creating spaces for collaboration. They're inviting in the surrounding neighborhood, and that's just with a cooperative or a co-housing approach. The Community Land Trust brings in the whole surrounding neighborhood to have a genuine stake in what's being built in their area, and a lot of the like, for example, the Community Land Trusts in London have thousands of members. Most of them won't be residents, but they're members of the local community who want to see affordable housing in their neighborhood, and they're an active participant in that. So community-led housing has, I mean, in addition to that, there's kind of environmental benefits. The community-led housing and the scale of it typically kind of provides a medium scale between an individual house and a kind of large scale housing development. That is a brilliant scale, we think, for innovation, and you see that with the projects across Europe. They're pioneering environmental design, innovative environmental design, and long-term sustainability in a way that it is more challenging, I think, to do at a large scale. So there's also a huge amount to be learned from, and you can see these projects as kind of test beds for the wider kind of housing network, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, from our position in Cloughjordan, so that's a community-led housing project. We've been living here now for about 15 years. The benefit to the rural town of Cloughjordan which was losing the potential of schools, or there's a lot of the aspects of a community was being lost. The train station was under threat. And so bringing 200 new residents and building that population back up to the sort of scale it was at has a huge benefit for the local economy, for the wider community in that rural town. And that I think is a massive benefit. Any of the other panelists want to look at this, Tom?
To that, in the policy booklet, we've included the reasons that local authorities in Europe give for supporting community-led housing. And they list out how community-led housing kind of meets their sort of social policy objectives as well. So as to add to what Padraig was saying, that these are kind of recognised by a lot of city and local authorities across Europe as well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Tom. Okay, well, we move on. There's another question that's maybe follows on from that, from Mary Deary, and the question on urban versus rural. Does community-led housing work better in rural areas or in urban areas? Anyone up for responding to that question? Again, my experience is a rural regeneration, but I think that sort of city neighbourhood and town development is crucial right now, especially as we think about how we respond to the challenges of climate change. And I think there's opportunities emerging from even the pandemic in rethinking how we work, that we're not necessarily fixed to having to commute to somewhere, so we could actually redevelop both rural towns and villages by having good places and neighbourhoods to live in, but also redevelop some urban centres that are really essential. Again, as Rory mentioned there with they're dead places, some of our urban centres, and we need to repopulate them. The concept of living above the shop again, or pocket neighbourhoods that can infill spaces and really create the vibrancy and the critical mass needed for a stronger local economy. Padraig?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on that as well, Davy. I think Rosie kind of addressed it well there when she mentioned the particular challenges they have in rural Ireland as distinct from cities. I think it's the flexibility of the community-led housing approach and its focus on specific local context means that it responds to both. And we've seen examples, like again across Europe, really urban examples in the heart of capital cities across Europe that are making a huge impact. But also across the UK, for example, in rural areas, it's having a massive effect on revitalising towns that have been dying for a few years and town centres that have been dying for a long time. So I wouldn't say it's specific to a particular area. I think it responds quite effectively to the unique challenges in each area.
Not necessarily also just about housing, like what you find across the UK is that community assets are also taken in by a structure like a community land trust for the benefit of the community, where it's not otherwise kind of economically viable to run that in a small community.
Mm-hmm.
I would just quickly add, Davy, I mean, from what is particularly urban areas, that the not in my backyard phenomena can represent quite another obstacle on the road to development of different types of non-market housing, non-for-profit housing. So I think the lessons, so the fact that you have that strong community buy-in, but also the lessons learned for other parts of the sector, I think can be really valuable, because it's a genuine obstacle, surprisingly, in many urban areas. Just the fact that the neighbours, in fact, are opposed to the development. So it's a good way to illustrate indeed how you can. I think the fact that the examples I've seen in Community Land Trust also work on those common areas, green spaces around the housing. And if they can also be open up for people who are not necessarily living in the houses themselves, this is also can be a key point to get planning permission and to get the ball rolling.
Yeah, again, it's that articulated shared understanding of what this approach is. I mean, we've had a problem here in the last year of a sort of really bad attempt to frame co-living, and that's tainted all our community-led projects, because this top-down, large-scale return to bedsits almost form of development now is what people think we're talking about when we say co-housing, and might be resisted. So there's another question just on that might add to this on the using existing buildings for community-led housing. Do any of the panelists see potential for your community-led housing tools to help residents to adapt, supplement or retrofit either new build or existing housing developments? Also relevant to the suitability of community-led housing for non-standard urban info sites. Interesting question from Max Stevenson. Anyone want to touch on that, Tom?
Yeah, well, I would just say off the top of my head, looking at working with existing buildings, especially outside of Dublin, I think there's a lot of potential there. You're not kind of working with a greenfield situation. You don't have a problem with like planning. It'll be a much easier proposition for authorities in that respect, and they're often buildings are quite cheap in comparison with land for development. So there's a kind of a spectrum of benefits that would accrue to the town where you're looking, or the village, and to the community itself. So in a mutual sense.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to come in on that?
Well, Davey, Rory here. I think that touches on a really important, more general point. One of the things we learned in NESC right from our earliest work in 2004, looking at international developments, and then more recently, was that it's not sufficient to rely on arm's length kind of fiscal instruments like the vacant site levy, and some people suggest a very punitive land tax to take away the uplift. And our learning is that actually those instruments are actually much less effective than they promise, and a much more active engagement. You have to be more active than that. You don't tend to get the results you want from these passive fiscal instruments, partly because they're highly technical and people can evade them, but the whole process requires more active engagement. And then, so in the case of these infill sites, somebody has to actively say, we're going to make something out of this, and then engage the relevant actors like your community group, or indeed existing tenants or residents. So I think that question about infill speaks to that, that we can fool ourselves that there's some kind of very big top-down lever, if only someone would pull it, that will solve the problem.
But maybe there's an opportunity if we could imagine different approaches to housing, like we're talking about with community-led housing, for a group of people in that community to see an option for a derelict or site that could be developed in their town and village. Yeah, there's a nice, yeah,
David, John here. If I could just jump in, yeah, I think, huge opportunity, to use existing buildings, and it's an easier way, of getting started, in terms of co-housing. So, definitely, the use of existing buildings is one way to go, definitely.
Yeah, I've seen some great examples across Europe of large houses being turned into smaller units, everyone still having their own autonomy, but more shared space. There's a nice reflection from Yvonne Boland in Kildare. From the perspective of a large growing urban centre like Newbridge, we have the sense that the growth, oh, my question just disappeared, sorry. Where did that go? In the growing urban centre like Newbridge, we have the sense that the growth has been driven by a very specific model of huge standard housing estates where local input in the planning process is undermined. We're getting housing growth without accompanying community growth. Very interesting question there. Question actually from Scotland, David Somerville in Scotland. How can state land be made available for community-led housing? Anyone want to touch on that?
In the land booklet, we've kind of proposed something on that, and that's basically where we might build on kind of existing planning frameworks that local authorities already have. So to start with the housing strategy that a local authority has to prepare every 5 years, and to assess in that the the need for community-led housing in the local area. And then to add to that, a register of interest for community-led housing groups, so that the local authority has this register. And then that would allow local authorities then to start developing a strategy as to what sites would be suitable. I also wanted to reference just there in the last question, something that's been developed in London called the Small Sites, a small builders project, and that's where Greater London Authority is setting aside smaller sites that aren't really suitable for large property developers for community-led housing projects, in order to, first of all, enable community-led housing, but also to diversify the market. So to allow smaller builders, smaller operators to come in, and so you're not always relying on the big developers. So there's a range of options, but I think the basic thinking behind it is, if you can kind of enable people or enable, say, a large number of small projects to emerge, rather than trying to concentrate on a small number of large projects to solve everything. So I think that's the basic thinking behind these strategies.
Great. There's a question, or a few questions, really looking at housing as a commodity. Housing and land are viewed as commodities. How can we change this view and get away from the idea of the home as an investment or an asset to speculate with? Anyone want to touch or respond to that question?
Well,
Come in, Rory.
yeah, I mean, I think in a sense, to be fair to people, they get stuck in a system, you know, in a sense. I think what we've learned is that the private housing system, ownership system, and the rental system are like cousins of each other. And in an unstable housing system like we've had, then you kind of need a casual rental sector where landlords can get in and get out at the top, etc. So everyone is stuck in a way in a system where and the struggle for affordability and suitable accommodation. So I think all the discussions we're having now are making clear that people do see housing more as a home, and now we need the policies to kind of move to complement that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Tom, and then we're going to have to be, or Sorcha?
Yeah, I think I would agree with that approach, but if you, I think it's very, it's the question, obviously. I hate the expression elephant in the room, but it is in a way the elephant in the room. But definitely we see that when you're building up the alternatives to the market, where you have where they are affordable forever, indeed, so where the price is regulated in the long term, whether that's community-led housing, community land trust, whether that's affordable home ownership, social housing, public housing, the more you have, so the higher the proportion is of that alternative to purely market-driven housing, the more you have a balancing effect. So you see, we do a regular study, annual study in the Austrian market, and you see the impact it has to have that large proportion of what they call limited profit cooperative housing, and the impact that has then on the rental prices in the area. So it's about the proportions, you know. And then of course on the other side you have to look at the ongoing fiscal advantages for big money, let's say, to enter the real estate market. And obviously that's a very difficult question, where I think you mentioned, Rory, the need for a housing commission, and you need cross-party agreement on that, because otherwise it becomes too ideological. So that's another good example coming from Austria. They managed to have this cross-party agreement and cross-party vision for the housing sector, and those big fiscal questions do really have to be tackled, because it's just too interesting still to invest in real estate for short-term profit. So though we can't escape that, but at the same time, we have to be building up the bulk on the other side of the limited profit housing.
We are good. Thank you, Circa. Thank you, all the panelists. We're going to have to leave it there. There's a huge amount of questions still to be answered. There's quite a lot of the answers in the chat and more questions in the chat. We will try and capture some of these and might become some frequently asked questions or something in the future. I'm sorry I had to cut it short, but we are going to finish at 13:30. So we've two more little pieces. Next, we've got some closing remarks from Eddie Taaffe, who's the program coordinator of the Housing Delivery Coordination Office at LGMA, the local government management agency. Eddie, fantastic to have you here. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Davy, and thanks for the opportunity to present here today. And I think it's been a fascinating discussion, and I'm very much enthused by the level of reaction, the level of positivity, and the can-do attitude of all the participants who've contributed so far. I suppose, firstly, what I'd like to do is just say, I think local authorities very much welcome the self-organised architecture policy documents. And I think, we really have to applaud the work done by SOA Research in preparation of the roadmap. The policy documents and the recommendations give clear and I think very comprehensive recommendations for the role and development of community-led housing solutions and how they can be mainstreamed into the range of solutions to housing across the state. The publication is very timely, given the government's commitment to publishing the new Housing for All policy document, which is due in the middle of this year. And one of the things that's going to be in Housing for All, I expect, is, in accordance with the programme for government, will be an emphasis on greater urban redevelopment and regeneration in town centres and other brownfield sites around the country. At the moment, in preparation for the new multi-annual social and affordable housing delivery programme, local authorities are assessing their remaining land holdings for suitability for housing. And I think local authorities are very conscious that not all of its existing sites are suitable or appropriate for social housing for a variety of reasons, but may well be suitable for alternative forms of housing, such as community-led or co-housing models. And I think, again, that feeds into the timeliness of this discussion. I think the policy documents will be very useful to the local authority sector as a roadmap as to how this can be delivered. And local authorities already have a very, strong and long track record of dealing with land provision and making land available to community groups, and also working on housing solutions with the approved housing body sector. My own opinion is that community-led housing has huge potential to become an important part of the development of sustainable and affordable housing. And over the last few weeks, you can't turn on the news or read a newspaper without a huge amount of commentary and debate about the sustainability of the housing solutions. And to my mind, community-led housing is probably one of the ultimate sustainable forms of housing that's out there. The challenge now, I think, is to get the political system, be that at local or national level, to bring community housing in as one of the fundamental planks of delivery and get it recognised, be that a legal recognition, some sort of formal recognition. And that's what local authorities, I think, will need if this is to progress further and roll out the way it should be rolled out and become a main or a significant element of the solution in the future. So they're my main thoughts on it, Davy. I'll wrap up with that, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's perfect, Eddie. Thank you for that. That was really good. So before I just hand to Padraig and Tom for the closing and signposting to where you can find everything, I'd just like to thank SOA for allowing me to participate in the year-long process and be able to facilitate not just this meeting, but the other forums and meetings. It was a real rich experience and just a pleasure. So handing back to Tom and Padraig to really signpost where we can go next steps, and close. Rory.
Thanks, thanks, Davy. Yeah, so I'm just going to say what our hopeful call to action is. So we kind of politely ask that you read the publication or the parts of the publication that you think would be interesting. So it's now available for download at this address here. So the booklets are free to download, and you can share them. They're produced on a Creative Commons basis. So we've also created a short video that attempts to highlight the range of approaches and contexts for community-led housing in Ireland. And it features 4 of the groups that have participated as stakeholders in the project, who are already at this moment pioneering inspirational projects across Ireland. And this video is on the same webpage, which is the next slide. So we're asking you to please spread the word about community-led housing with your local representatives, your local authorities, and your networks, and to get involved in creating or supporting community-led housing and development in Ireland. Thank you. Next slide, please. Padraig.
Sorry, I was muted. I just wanted to do a few quick thank yous because there was a huge range of people involved in this project over the last year. So just to our panelists today, it was really excellent contributions, and we're delighted that you all agreed to attend today. We wanted to thank Davy again for fantastic facilitation. He's been doing it throughout for the last year and a half on the project. We wanted to thank our sponsors, the Housing Agency, the LDA, O'Coolan and Co-Housing Alliance, and the Goethe Institute. We also wanted to thank our steering group and the wide range of stakeholders who contributed to the project over the last year. It really was a really diverse and wide ranging group, and really they brought a lot to it, excuse me, and informed the research. I also wanted to thank Claire Prevost for the graphic design of the whole publication and the roadmap infographics. And we wanted to thank our colleagues, Colin MacDonald and Jim Roach from SOA, who've been working with us on all of this and our other projects as well over the last few years. And last but not least, we just wanted to thank the community-led housing groups, the 8 groups who participated in the project and who are working to develop community-led homes across Ireland. And we hope that this will help them to get the support that they need to do that. So thanks, everyone.